What's folk sociology and how good is it at helping us understand behavior? By Todd Jones. Okay, trying to get the next slide here. There we go. Okay, human beings are strongly motivated to understand the world around them, and that curiosity really isn't limited to professional scholars. Professional academics have physics, botany, and medicine, but ordinary people have folk physics, folk botany, and folk medicine. Now, among other things that people want to understand is other human beings. And we have often talked about a folk psychology that we use to understand other human beings. And that locally is a way to understand human behavior. But I think we also use something called folk sociology to understand collections of people. Now, unlike folk psychology, folk sociology hasn't been studied much. This talk will look at what folk sociology is and some of its problems. Now, folk sociology in a nutshell is a widely held theory used by ordinary people to understand other people's collective thinking and behavior. It's really the folk analog of professional sociology, just like folk physics is the folk analog of physics. What do we mean by it's a widely held view? It's just the idea that if lots and lots and lots of people hold it, then it's a folk view. Folk is here to contrast not with professional, because a lot of professionals might have folk sociological views and folk sociological theories. And some of the folk might hold professional views. So the idea is that folk sociology is just the sociology that's widely held among lots of groups of ordinary people. Okay. And maybe professionals as well. Okay, now the sociology in folk sociology refers to the ideas and subject matter of this theory being analogous to those of academic sociology. And of course, what's that? That's a matter of historical accident. There seem to be two things that professional sociologists focus on. One is they focus on collections of people as opposed to individual people, like corporations or employers or the countries of the Northern Hemisphere, right? It's also defined in terms of being types of people, like employers as opposed to biological types. So an example might be Republicans now have more loyalty to Trump than they do to democracy. That's an example of folk sociology because it looks at types of people, and you also look at types of collections in folk sociology. Okay, now what's it mean to be a widespread theory? That's a good question. What's a theory? What exactly is and isn't a theory has been debated in philosophy for a century or so. Roughly, there's a rough consensus, but lots and lots of disagreement outside this, that theory is a set of representations of entities and properties in a certain realm and a set of beliefs about how to best collect more information about this realm. Okay. Now, we use folk sociology all the time to explain collective thinking and behavior. Pick up any newspaper or magazine article and you'll find it full of examples of folk sociology. And I mean, I don't really need to belabor this because it's everywhere. Like virtually every column by David Brooks or Ross Douthat or many other, famous columnists, you're going to get a kind of folk sociology about why this is happening. This one says, people in this precarious state are going to demand stories, and that'll explain their distress back to them. And that's why QAnon is popular. That's why Donald Trump is popular. He's engaging in folk sociology. Okay, so folk sociology consists of beliefs that are widespread in the population about socially defined types of people, collections of people, and using these beliefs to draw further inferences and further conclusions. You use the theory to do that. Now, American folk sociology includes beliefs like big cities are more safe or are more unsafe than small towns. People from small towns are more narrow-minded. Guys are generally messy, unclean. Black athletes are better than white athletes. You can always hire Mexicans to work cheaply for cash. Teenagers routinely oppose their parents' wishes. When people are thinking in terms of these ideas, they're using folk sociology. Okay. Now, when we want to use folk sociology to study North America, or use sociology to study North America is our subject. My subject here is, okay, what is folk sociology? So if we're looking at folk sociology, the main focus we want to say is, what is it? What are the widespread folk sociological beliefs? Which of these are most true and most useful most often, which give the greatest benefits, and which ones are most harmful? And how are people use folk sociology to arrive at further beliefs in ways that produce good ones or in ways that produce bad ones? So that's what we want to look at when we study folk sociology, is what is it doing well and badly? Okay, now, among the most common problems of our folk sociological thinking, and I'm not going to talk a lot about, well, it does well. That's a good question. It's a good question in research. I know a lot about what it does badly. Here's one thing it does badly. Almost any folk sociological of the claim that says the X people do or think or have Y is usually very vague and ambiguous, right? You don't know what it means. When you say the X do Y, does it mean the X as a fusion, as a collection of people does Y, like Amazon wants to put small bookstores out of business? Or are you saying that a group of members all tend to want to do this, or most tend to want to do this? We call this the descriptive norm of a group. When you say something like Amazon workers don't want to be in a union, that's what you might call a descriptive norm. What is it? What's true about a certain percentage of the people in Amazon? Or you might say it might mean the X do Y. The activity is one that group members will praise or punish, or else people believe that certain activities will be praised or punished. So the idea is, look at Amazon, you don't arrive late. That may or may not be true, but it's a prescriptive norm. It's something that people expect of the workers. Okay. Now, each of these main interpretations of the X do Y are themselves have lots and lots of subtypes. If what we're doing is talking about a descriptive norm where you're saying, here's a bunch of the X, it does Y. When we represent that and when people make phrases that express that idea, they don't really say which of a number of different types it could be. Like, so it might be, and I wrote a book on this about the different kind of things it could mean, right? Most or the majority of the X do Y is one thing it could mean, like men like taking showers more than baths, mean most men do. Or it could be, you're not saying most do this really, literally, it's a kind of caricature, like philosophy professors don't work on Fridays. Or a third thing it could be is there's a number of X that do Y, and it's surprising that they do. It may not really be all of them. So when you say, look, the workers at the applesauce plant, they play chess on their lunch breaks. You might not mean all of them or most of them do. You're just surprised that some of them do. And so you can still say that, yeah, this is what the workers at the applesauce plant do. So sometimes it means a number of X do a surprising Y. Okay. A fourth thing it could mean is that a plurality. When you say, like, people in Humboldt counties drive pickup trucks, it might not mean the majority do, but it might mean a plurality does. They drive pickup trucks more than anything else is done, even though that's not a majority. Or it might mean that some groups in the X do Y, and that makes the X group distinct. So when you say Chicagoans like deep dish pizza, that's what they mean. It's not like all of Chicagoans do or most of Chicagoans do. It's Chicagoans is where they do. That's what makes the X group distinct. Or you might mean not everybody in the X, but some salient subgroup that people hopefully will get in mind from the context. When somebody says Las Vegans are really into belly dancing these days, you clearly don't mean all Las Vegans. Well, you clearly don't mean that, but it's not really clear how many you do mean or what you do mean. And that's a problem. I mean, a problem with this is it's just an incredibly vague kind of claim, like most X do Y folk sociological claims are. So one of the problems is once you do that, the rest of your reasoning is going to get wonky. because when you say things like, when you do statistical syllogisms, right? A statistical syllogism, it says, a certain percentage of the X does Y, so-and-so is a percentage of the X, so they're going to do Y. You don't know unless you know what size that percentage is. So if you again take that sentence, people in Humboldt counties mostly drive pickup trucks, and Harry lives in Humboldt County. Does he drive a pickup truck? That's what people will often conclude, but that's not likely true, actually, if that's interpreted as a plurality rather than a majority. Okay, so that's going to be a problem. Okay. Now, aside from the question of what kind of population is being true, what kind of population is being referenced and being ambiguous, there's a big question about whether or not the claim is even true, right? Because if you think of the way people form these beliefs, they're not looking at the whole population. They're looking at a sample, but they're not looking at a representative sample, right? Or a large sample, probably. And when they say, oh yeah, the X do Y, they're more likely to exaggerate how many do into expressing some type of like, oh yeah, it's lots or it's most, right? So this guy's saying New Yorkers are terrible drivers, right? So you've got all these problems with claims that are very common, of the form the X do or think or have Y. They're often vague or ambiguous. They're often built on unrepresentative samples and exaggerate the percentage of Y-havers there are. There's a whole set of other problems when these are formed on the basis of analogy. So the upshot is, look, if claims are of the form, the X people do Y, we have good reason to be suspicious of most claims of this form. Okay. And that's going to be a big problem because there's an awful lot of them. And people say things like, a classic one from ordinary sociology would be, and this is a problem there too. The new heir believed that when a man or woman dies, the flesh and the life of the soul separate. Which new heir are you talking about? How many? Are you talking about most, all, some? Is this a norm, a proscriptive norm, a descriptive norm? Same thing when you say the Democrats think that education is the solution to every job loss problem. It's an amazingly ambiguous sentence. So that's a problematic kind of claim. Okay. Now, that's just one sort of family of claims of problematic folk sociology. Another family of claims that are going to really be problematic are when these folk sociological claims are formed using folk psychology. Folk psychology, remember, is a set of platitudes of the beliefs and desires and other mental states we ordinarily use to understand thinking and behavior. And a lot of empirical research says that's actually our basic go-to form for understanding why people do what they do. They try to figure out what beliefs and desires other people have. Now, a lot of times you use folk psychology to form folks' sociological claims. Like, so a folk sociological claim, like something like Democrats work hard to sound folksy because they're full of self-doubt about whether they're real Americans. Or QAnon followers take great satisfaction in seeing what others cannot. How did people come up with that claim in the first place? They probably used folk psychological reasoning. And how do you use folk psychological reasoning? Well, there's the general schema. You say this entity was rational or this person was rational. They desire Y. They believe the world lives in state Q. They believe that actions ABC will interact with Q to produce Y. And so that's what they're going to do. They're going to do ABC to get what they want, right? Basic problem with folk psychology is there's always a very large number of belief-desire pairs that would generate any given behavior, right? If Tom wanted his factory to reopen and believed that electric Trump would help his factory reopen, Tom would vote for Trump. If Tom wanted Muslim immigrants to return to their home countries and believed that electing Trump would do that, Tom would vote for Trump. Why is Tom really voting for Trump? You got to guess at what his beliefs and desires are. How do we guess? There's lots and lots of different formulations of folk psychology, but what most experts in folk psychology claim is what we use ourselves as models. One form of folk psychology called the simulation theory says we explicitly use our own minds to model what other people are thinking. We say, we imagine if we were them, what would we be believing? What would be desiring? If we had their beliefs and desires, what would that make us want to do? Okay. Now you can see what the problem is going to be with that. That's going to work fairly well if people belong to groups that are like the groups we belong to. But it's not going to work very well if the people we're doing that for are quite different from us. So if we were trying to think about what would I be thinking if I were a police officer, and you've never worked as a police officer or never come close to that, or what would I be thinking about if I was the suspect arrested by a police? If you've never been arrested by the police in a confrontation, you're going to have a hard time thinking what your beliefs and desires would be. So in kind of situations like that, which is an awful lot of situations, we're not going to have reliable beliefs and desires formed. And this is certainly going to be true if we're saying, what does China think? What does Russia think? What are the countries in the northern hemisphere thinking? Those kinds of entities, there are some people who think that those really can't have beliefs and desires for real. It's just a metaphor. I'm on record thinking they can have beliefs and desires for real, but whatever they are, they're not going to be like ours. Okay. So a large category of folk sociological claims are usually be problematic. And these are ones that we use formulating folk psychology. Okay. Now, people might object at this point and say, all right, Jones, all you've been talking about is the fact that people are going to hold unjustified beliefs and reason poorly. But we don't need a specialized investigation into our thinking to tell us that. Well, that's true, we don't. What I really want to stress here is understanding why that happens with an eye to what we can do about it, and really want to stress that it's not just poor thinking people that do it. We all do it, just like we all use folk psychology. I want to stress we all use folk sociological thinking, and it's problematic. Most political journalism is full of problematic folk sociological thinking, right? A great deal of scholarship in the humanities is dedicated to using fictional text to help us come up with new and often very problematic folk sociological conclusions, right? When people say things like, look, what Brave New World really does is show us that when we trade competitive striving for a life of productive welfare, we end up feeling that we have nothing to live for, all right? They're trying to use the humanities to get us to believe folk sociological conclusions. Okay. And that's folk sociology isn't real sociology. It really is as if we're diagnosing people's ailments all the time using our grandmother's folk medicine, and everybody sort of tolerates that and thinks that's just fine. I think we shouldn't tolerate that and think that's just fine. Folk sociology is full of problems. We should try to do something about it. Now, what can we do? I don't think it's, now a lot of people say folk psychology is a way we're automatically hardwired into thinking. That might or might not be true, but I don't think we're hardwired to think in terms of folk sociology. And just as we've been pretty successful at getting people to notice, hey, this way of thinking about, let's say, this ethnic group or these gender roles, this is stereotypical thinking that we want to avoid. We could do the same thing with all kinds of folk sociological claims. So I think we should work on getting people to see claims as examples of folk sociology, and just get people to recognize, oh, this is an example of folk sociology, and here's where folk sociology goes wrong very often, right? We could do this in our critical thinking classes. Instead of just pushing like, this is a hasty generalization and here's what's wrong with that, we could say, and one of the main times we do hasty generalizations is with folk sociology. We look at a group, we see a certain percentage of the group doing it, and we say, yeah, all those members of this group do that, right? Folk sociology happens all the time when we do hasty generalizations. We could really stress that when we teach critical thinking. We could stress it when we teach the actual social sciences themselves, right? We could say, look, here is the way we want to make sure we understand these populations scientifically. But here's what folk sociology does to depart from that. And I think one of the things we want to remember is two things folk sociology does is often stress or avoid making sure that you have a representative sample. Folk sociology really doesn't care about that, even if scientific sociology does. Typically, folk sociology makes claims about causation that doesn't look at if what happens also happens in control populations that don't have the suspected causal variable. Folk sociology almost never uses control groups in their thinking. Real sociology strives to when it's working well. Okay. In journalism classes, we could say that, look, many of the topics that writers in journalism cover are really systematically studied by real sociologists, psychologists, economists, and political scientists who do look at carefully constructed samples and who do use control groups. These studies, I think, really should be consulted before writing articles instead of just saying, well, let me just say what my folk sociology reasoning says off the top of my head. And I think this should really be done in the humanities. It's just very common in the humanities to say, and here's what this tells us about society, right? Instead, we should say, here are the kind of folk sociological beliefs that people are likely to pick up when they read 1984. Here are some ideas about the corruptness of all governments, or something that people are likely to pick up. And let's notice that this is an example of folk sociology. You know, the humanities have made great strides at catching when people are going to come to racist and sexist or homophobic conclusions. If they come to folk sociological conclusions, that can be just as problematic. Okay, so in general, I think it would be really helpful to get people to identify when things are folk sociology. I think we really should treat folk sociology the way we treat folk physics or folk medicine, and realize that it's frequently problematic in places. And remember that we've got real non-folk social science that works hard to avoid the problems of folk social science. And for years and years and years, there's been this debate about folk psychology about eliminativism, right? Is folk psychology really a poor theory without much truth or without much usefulness? That's been a really interesting and important debate. I think we ought to have that same kind of interesting, important debate about whether or not folk sociology is an important and useful theory, and how does it go wrong most likely? Do its benefits, which we haven't talked about here, really outweigh the problems it'll be? All right, thank you very much.